city to city, country to country, on the world's local television network. It's his Channel Live.
But a lot of it for me was, number one, applying a good, what I would hope to be good witness testimony ideas against the Gospels themselves. So, for example, if I'm looking at a witness and trying to determine is this really a reliable eyewitness to the case, I'm going to ask a couple simple things. I'm going to ask, number one, was he really there? Is there something about his testimony that gives away the fact that he was never really there? So I'm looking to make sure, and I'm also looking in the forensic case, let's say 30 years have gone by, and now I'm reading the eyewitness testimony. He may say something about the events of that week, or the event that I can go back and check out historically and see if this guy was really even there. So proximity to the actual murder is important to me. Did he really, was he really present to see what he said he saw? And so I apply that same approach to the writers of the Gospels. I believe the Gospels are very early on and much greater thinkers than I, and much greater work has been done than I would ever do. And I've read all that work about dating the Gospels. But the shorthanded version from my perspective is this. I mean, we know that Acts is written and ends with Paul in Rome. He's still alive at the end of the book. We think he dies maybe 62, 63, 64 if you really want to stretch it. So you know that your Acts probably is written well before the mid-60s. There's also no mention of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. So you've got good reason to substantiate that belief that, that Acts is finished before the mid-60s. Now, you know, it's also a second part to a two-part volume, including Luke and Acts. So if you just go back in time and say, well, gosh, the trips that Luke is actually chronicling, you might put Luke then at some point well before the completion of Acts. Let's say you just go 5 years before. Well, now you're in the late 50s, early 60s, probably late 50s, even being very generous with the dating. And you know that Luke is borrowing much of his material because he's a good investigator. He tells you up front he's doing this. And he's borrowing from the testimony of other people who saw the events, like Mark. Much of Mark's material you see in Luke. So you know that Mark then has to be someplace well before Luke. Well, just on that quick little jot of you know that you've got a gospel that shows up in the 50s. And if that's true, you've got people who are still alive, who saw Jesus crucified, saw him risen, and are now writing gospels, writing gospel accounts. And I think that there's enough other evidence to substantiate the fact, because there are historical events that are mentioned in the Gospels, that for many years, many people, like Luke, for example, was highly criticized until the beginning of last century, when people started doing the archaeological work that substantiated so much of Luke's Gospel.
So he knew what he was talking about.
He was called a liar for a long time.
Many times.
But he actually ends up being right. So when you find that the things you thought were lies were actually substantiated by archaeology, you start to kind of look at it a second time. Now, of course, as a skeptic, I had the nasty problem of miracles. Because this history seems to be pretty good. But I have these miracles.
What about these miracles?
So you have to kind of deal with that. But before we even get to that, another aspect I'm looking at here is there a motive? Is there a motive behind the witness that might cause that person to lie to me or to make a false statement? And so I've always seen the same. I teach this to all of the people I've ever pastored over the years, or that I've taught as a youth pastor, that there are three motives, three things that lie behind every crime. And they're always the same three things in my view. So bear with me on this.
No problem.
They are financial greed, sexual lust, and power, the desire for power. It's greed, lust, and power that you can almost work every murder at least back down to these three attributes. And most other things you see are subsets of one of those three. So I'm looking at the witnesses and saying, what was going to benefit them from a greed, lust, power perspective? Now, you know these folks, how they died. You know how the apostles and the writers of the Gospels died. They died miserable deaths. They were chased across the country constantly. And while I'm sure they had many people in their small congregations that loved them, they did not attain power as we would think of it as. And certainly the cost for whatever little power they had seemed like to outweigh the benefit. So I don't think you can really attribute in the lust. I mean, these are people who took on austere lives, very virtuous lives, at great cost, personal cost to themselves, and it just seems to me that they lack the kind of native motive I typically see in witnesses that makes me question whether the witness is telling the truth.
Now, let me ask them, what about the fact that they were solid fishermen? You're not talking about philosophers or intellectuals. They're hard-headed, normal, everyday people. Did that enter into your thinking?
Yeah, I think that it always does. I mean, we're looking for people who don't have a horse in the race.
Exactly.
And we're looking for people who are not trying to advance a certain theological position.
Okay.
They're not trying to advance a certain power structure.
Good.
They're not trying to advance something that will cause more their stable to grow. They'll cause the relationships to grow. They're looking. They simply saw this.
Yeah.
I don't even like the fact that I'm burdened with this.
Yeah.
But I saw it, so I'm going to tell you about it. As a matter of fact, along the way, you see people like Peter just make a mess of things occasionally. It almost feels like, he knows he has a responsibility to share the truth, but he doesn't always feel like he's all that equipped to do it. You know what I mean? So you see that kind of a struggle, and you go, wow, it just speaks to me as a very real, very raw eyewitness to the account who's doing the best he can, and it was going to cost him his life someday to tell the truth about what he saw.